Hello, welcome to Shad Life. Do you want to see me take this fork apart and show you what's inside? I bet you do. I certainly want to do it. So, what is this fork? Well, this is an RST space jump fork. Yeah, you've probably never heard of it. I almost think this was a prototype, and I think Fox had something to do with this fork. This is like from 2010 or something like this, and I got it for free when I was working at Quality Bicycle Products, and I don't quite remember the details of why I got it, but I had it on a bike for a while and stuff. It is a dirt jump fork, and it's actually a pretty good one, believe it or not. I know RST isn't known for making high quality stuff like Fox and RockShox and so on, but this particular RST fork is pretty well made. So let's take it apart and see what's inside, and then when I get to the internals of this fork, I'll explain to you a little bit about what they do. This fork does take air, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. Also, if you ever, here, this is super important, if you ever decide to take a fork apart and it has air, you absolutely, number one, first thing you do, release the air out of that fork. It is actually pretty dangerous if you don't, because I'm literally going to take this cap off, and with the amount of air pressure that's in there, when that last few threads release, this is going to want to take off like a rocket. So let the air out before you do anything. I'm actually surprised there's not like warnings on there or something. But anyway, let's get to it and take this thing apart. So what did I just say? Well, take the air out. So that's what I'm going to do. Take this little air cap off. It actually says air on it. And then I'm going to take whichever size of my hex key fits in there and just press down on that valve and let all the air out. So there it goes. And I'm going to double check, make sure all the air is out. Okay, so I'm going to throw that. Can I do that? Yeah, I think you can put that cap back on. Actually, it'll get in the way of the socket when I use it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these off. So in order to do that, I have to take the rebound adjustment knob off. On this fork, the rebound adjustment is on the top. A lot of forks, it'll be down here. This one just has the two bolts that kind of hold the uppers and lowers together. But I'm going to take this out. I need a little Phillips screwdriver. Another thing, I hear clicking in there. So I'm going to suspect that there's probably bearings in there and springs, because that's generally how these things work. And I don't want those things to go flying everywhere. So I have to be careful to make sure those bearings and springs don't come out. So I'm going to do that next. Okay, now you can see that little dial is removed. Here's the little piece that it grabs and turns, kind of hex shaped. So now I have two big kind of nut shaped things here, and I do believe, is this an 18? Is that what it is? I think I just took it out of the box and guessed. Yeah, I'll put down in the comments what size it is, right, or down in the comments down on the screen right here. So basically I want to just take these off and remove both sides of this fork. So I'm going to start with the air side, and this should have an air cartridge in it. So once I get that out, I'll show it to you. So get the last few threads off in here. I can feel it's loose. So I'm going to pull this out, and you'll see that it's got a little rubber seal on there, and it actually is airtight when it goes in there. I can actually, when I push down, I can feel it pushing back, like it's kind of interesting. And I'm not even touching the spring yet. So that is where the air goes in, and it comes out the bottom there, and it basically pressurizes the chamber of this fork. I'll talk about why you do that in just a second, But let's put this aside and let me pull the spring out of here. All right, this is where my hands are gonna get really dirty. So I'm gonna reach down, get the spring out of here. Sometimes if you can't do it with your hand, you can use something to grab it or tip it upside down. You just don't want to drop this on the ground because it'll get all dirty. But there's a spring in there, and I can see the spring is progressive. Where this wrap is up here, the spring is actually spaced. The coils are spaced more apart, and then down here the coils are closer together. And I'll explain to you why that's that way also. So I'm going to set the spring down. Okay, so we've got one side of the fork out. So that's interesting. We still have to take the lowers off, but we want to release this other side. This is the rebound side, right? So I'm going to go take this off, and then once I get this out, I'll show you what's inside. Okay, so I already know this isn't going to pull all the way out. It's stuck in there. There's a reason for that. It connects to a little piece at the bottom here, and so I have to remove these in order to separate the uppers from the lowers, and then once I do that, I can then get this all the way out, and then I'll show it to you. Okay, so I took that bolt out of this side, so now this will come all the way out. And look at that. It's a damper. And I'll talk about what a damper does here in a moment, but I'm going to go set this down and we'll get the lowers and the uppers separated here. Okay, so I took the other side out, so I should be able to separate these two. Oh, there it goes. All right. Cool. So, lowers, uppers, fork is completely apart. So, yeah, let's talk about what all these different things do. Because that's the cool part of this. When you get a fork apart, you can see all the different things and what they do in the fork. Okay, so these two parts are obvious. You know, this mounts to your bike, this mounts to your wheel, and they're gonna move up and down within each other. But how these two parts interact with each other has a lot to do with what's going on inside here and in here. So let's show you the internals. We'll start with the spring, and then we'll talk about the damper. Okay, so this is the spring, and the fact that these are a little more spaced out and this is a little tighter over here, and there's this wrapping on here, has more to do with the spring rate progression. So it'll be softer at the top and then get more firm at the bottom of its progression as it gets compressed. This is the main part of the suspension. This is what makes the suspension have spring as suspension. Don't know how else to describe it. It allows it to push down and it pushes back up and it makes your forks go up and down. So it is the extremely important part of your suspension. The problem with only having this is if this was all you had for suspension, and yeah, this is going to be a little insult on department store bikes, Target bikes, Walmart bikes, whatever you want to call it. This is all they have for suspension, is they just put a spring in there and then they make it look like a cool bike, and then it just goes boing, a boing, a boing, and there's not a whole lot of damping or control going on, and they're just not very good bikes. And that's what makes them really cheap and inexpensive to make, and they really can't handle real mountain biking, real off-road riding. But you need more than just a spring for suspension. So let me talk a little bit about the damper. So this part is really cool. What this does is it controls how the spring reacts. It's interesting. So the spring's going to do its thing. When you land hard and you come down and the fork compresses, the spring is in majority of control at that point. But then when it returns, this kicks in, and if you push and pull on it really fast, it has some give to it. And depending on how much rebound I put on there, if I turn the rebound like all the way to the negative, there's going to be hardly any control of the spring, and the spring is going to be really bouncy. It's going to rebound really fast. If I add more rebound, this is going to fight a little bit and make that spring return slower. In a car, this is what your struts do. They dampen the spring. They keep the spring from just being a big bouncy pogo stick. Boing, boing, boing. So when this returns, it's going to prevent that spring from going through repetitive bounces. And so if you land on something and you feel your front end do a couple of bounces, that means you have too much rebound. You really want to land and have your spring and your fork come back up. Same with rear suspension. You want it to just do one return and then stabilize. You don't want it to do a couple of bounces. That's really bad. So that's what this does. This controls how the spring behaves. And that's what's super cool about it. An extremely important part of suspension right here. And super cool, and there's a dial that I can control it. So I said I was going to talk about the air. So why do we add air? There's a spring in the fork. It's going to create that suspension, give us that give that we need when we land, right? So why do we add air? Well, we add air, we generally call it preload. And what that basically means is we have many different weight riders. We have people who ride harder than other people. Maybe you're on a trail that's really bumpy and you want this fork to be relatively soft and absorb those bumps, but you don't want it to bottom out, so you got to set the air to handle the type of riding, the rider weight, all of that, the preload. So how much pressure is needed to get the spring to work. And so basically the spring does a large majority of the work. The air adds air volume to that chamber and makes it firmer or softer depending on how much air you put in there. So it's basically really all the air does. And different forks have different advancements and technologies that control the air, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you definitely want, you know, a fork that has these kind of settings. There are some forks that are decent, that are spring only, and they're going to be heavier because they're spring only, but they're going to be more durable and less maintenance pain and stuff like that. What they do is they do a lot of that with different springs. Sometimes there'll be multiple springs of different sizes and different compression rates, things like that. And then when you turn the dial to stiffen up the fork, you're like compressing one of those springs or so on and so forth. It gets kind of tricky. You can save a little bit of money, but it's generally better to have a fork that has some air in it, and it's better to have a fork that has a rebound adjustment with a damper like this in it. Just gives you that fine-tuned capability, and you find that on more expensive bikes. You won't find that on cheaper bikes. So there you have it. That's basically how a fork works inside, and each side of the fork does something different. One side takes the air, the other side handles the rebound and everything. That is why you see such stiff braces and why everything's so beefy on a fork, because if this stuff flexed or it wasn't stiff, then one side of the fork would want to do something different than the other side. They want this to be one solid unit, so each side of the fork is working together, and you won't notice that different sides of your forks are doing different things because of how beefy and strong this thing is. One of the main reasons why through axles have become standardized on suspension forks pretty much, especially on higher end ones, It used to be you just put a quick release axle in here. Well, then these were super flexy. Now when you have a through axle, you have this super strong kind of one piece component that doesn't flex and do as much as forks used to do. Forks used to be pretty flexy. The size of your stanchion, the crown, that's this part here is the crown. Let's put this down. These are the lowers. This is your steer tube. This is your crown, and these are the stanchions. What the crown has to also be really stiff and keep this from flexing and stuff. You don't want these independent legs moving. So the combination of the lowers and the strength of that and how stiff the crown is and things like that. This is an older fork, so it's 1 1/8 steer. Most newer forks now go 1 1/8 on top, taper to 1.5 on the bottom to help stiffen this area, make everything stronger. Very important part of your fork, because if any of this fails in here, you're on your bike, you're landing, you don't want this failing. So the stronger, beefier this is, the better. Again, more expensive bikes, you're going to get stronger components and things like that, and not wimpy, skinny stuff that flexes and has a risk of breaking if you're landing hard. Again, I go back to the department store bike. They may look like mountain bikes and bikes with suspension, but they're actually, in my opinion, if you rode them like we ride our more expensive bikes, it's dangerous. If you go off big drops and jumps and things on department store bikes, the rider is in danger of getting seriously hurt. So I just, I understand that people talk about, oh, well, it's all they can afford. It's true, but can you afford the medical bills because the bike wasn't capable of handling what you're dishing out? So really think about it. Don't just think that a cheaper bike is going to be able to handle bigger stuff that we're doing these days. So there you have it. So I'm going to put this bad boy back together. Okay, there we go. All back together. I haven't put air in it yet. I actually want to do some maintenance with this fork, but I wanted to show you how to take it apart and put it back together. 1 second. I'm going to plug a product here. It's called Buzzy's Slick Honey. I have the spray stuff, and I forget if it was Finish Line or was one of these companies, and basically I would spray it on the stanchions on my Marzocchi Z2, Bomber Z2 fork, on my tie bike, and on, what do I have on there, RockShox Pike, and it worked pretty good, but it was temporary. It would reduce the stiction. I started using this, and what I do is I rub it on the stanchion, and then I compress the fork a bit, and then I rub it on the stanchion, compress the fork a bit, and just try to get it to go around these seals here and lube the stanchion a little bit. Then I wipe the stanchion clean, because you don't really want this stuff collecting dirt or whatever, and it lasts a long time. It makes my fork nice and buttery smooth for a long time. So a quick little maintenance tip, you can get this almost anywhere. Buzzy's Slick Lube, it's got like a little, looks like a little bee or something on it, pretty funny. But there you have it. Took this thing apart, showed you what's inside, put it back together. Cool. So my next thing is I gotta do that fork. That fork is gonna be way more complicated than this one. This one's pretty simple. It's only got air and it's only got rebound. That one has high speed, low speed compression. It's got this off the top feature on the bottom. It's got rebound. It's got 2 different weight oils, 2.5 and 7.5 weight oil, as well as grease and lube like this inside of it. So that's going to be a much more complicated project. That's why I wanted to play around with this fork, and I figured while I'm playing around with this fork, I'll show it to you on the channel. I just wanted to get, for myself, to get a good understanding of suspension forks before I dive into that project. So my goal with that project is, that's a Diamond Sapphire D1, DVO by the way. I need to reduce the travel down to 120 millimeters, because right now it's set to 140 millimeters, which is going to be way too much travel for my mullet build here. It'll just slacken my bike too much. So yeah, I'll lower the travel, start out with 120. So I will do a video on that project when I get to it. Cool. I really appreciate your support for my channel. Please like and subscribe. Peace.